Ohio State going defensive coordinator shopping after having Matt Barnes, not that Matt Barnes, as the play caller midway through the season or early season, really. Ryan Day is deciding to go and hire a new defensive coordinator, and he goes and he just gets simply one of the best defensive coordinators that we've seen in college football, not just this year, but really over the last 2 years, as Oklahoma State's success has been with a good, well-coached, veteran-led defense, though obviously we've got some younger players on that Cowboys defense that have really thrived this season. So Jim Knowles is going to be the new defensive coordinator at Ohio State. Feels like a rich get richer kind of a move on the assistant coaching carousel. I'm sorry to Oklahoma State fans. I mean, he's been a huge part of the reason why you were up in the top 10 and beating Oklahoma. But for the Buckeyes, what do you see in terms of Jim Knowles' arrival in Columbus?
Well, you kind of touched on it. Like, Danny and Bud aren't here. So I was joking around that we were going to talk, do a Champions League preview, but I didn't mean to bring this kind of comparison up right away, but
transfer window.
Like how is this different to you than like the Premier League or any other? Like, the best teams in the country now are just sucking up everything that they want because they have more money than everybody else. So if you're a great coordinator somewhere and another, like a team competing for national title needs a coordinator, they're going to, grab you. If you're a head coach now, like that's the funniest thing. We've seen it in this coaching cycle where Notre Dame and Oklahoma are losing their coaches to other jobs, which is just like this strange kind of thing that you just don't typically see. And now I feel like Knowles is probably going to be the start of the same kind of movement on the coordinator front, where coordinators aren't like, not to say this is the first time this has ever happened, but in the past, it's like if Jim Knowles is leaving Oklahoma State, it's probably to become a head coach somewhere.
Oh, sure.
Now he's leaving. Like, he was mentioned as a candidate for the Duke job, and now instead of leaving to become a head coach, he's just going to go be a defensive coordinator at Ohio State for a lot more money than what he's already getting. So it is definitely a rich get richer move, but I think it's a good move for both parties, because I do think if you're Jim Knowles, like right now, you did an amazing job with that Oklahoma State defense. Like you showed up in Stillwater and kind of changed the narrative surrounding that program. Like, this was always a team that was, just a high flying offense scoring 45 points per game and just trying to outscore opponents. And it was never known for its defense. He came in, and now it's when you think of Oklahoma State these days, the first thing you think of is, oh, that's a great defense. The offense needs to catch up. So it's good for him in that now he's going to Ohio State, and where he's going to be working just like he's had good players at Oklahoma State, but at Ohio State, he's going to have NFL players. He's going to be at a team recruiting NFL talent. And this means that if he's able to kind of turn around or improve an Ohio State defense that has been that team's Achilles heel for the last few years, he's still going to be in line for head coaching jobs, but he'll probably be in line for much bigger jobs than Duke. And I think that's probably a factor in his decision here too. And I think that if you're Ohio State, this makes a ton of sense, not just because he improved Oklahoma State's defense, but it's how he improved it. Like, he mostly runs a 4-2-5, which is pretty common these days, but Ohio State's biggest problem the last few years defensively, like, at least as far as I've concerned that I've mentioned it, is like, we talk about their secondary and it's not great, but a part of it has been just the lack of overall pass rush. Like, this is a team that has had very good defensive linemen as far as recruiting ratings and talent and all that stuff. But since the Bosa's left, since Young left, they haven't really had a dominant pass rush. What did Oklahoma State lead the country in this year? Sacks. It was first in total sacks, it was first in sack rate, and it was fifth in pressure rate. I'm sure that played a huge part in Ryan Day looking at Jim Knowles and saying, that's the guy I want to get. And this is also Ryan Day's third defensive coordinator hire in 3 years. So clearly he understands it's a problem, and he's been trying to fix it for a while. I think they might have found the solution here, though.
How do we look at Ryan Day as as someone who has to put together a staff? I think that's something that we brought up a lot on the Cover 3 podcast recently that is not part of the discussion that I've always had, but I've been, turned on to it. For example, like, James Franklin clearly is good at identifying coaches who can go on to be successful. Is Anthony Poindexter official yet at Virginia?
It is not, but all the wind seems to be blowing in the direction that it's probably only a matter of time.
I think that would be 4. Joe Moorhead, Ricky Ronnie, Brent Pry, and Anthony Poindexter, former Penn State assistants that have gotten head coaching jobs.
He's going to be losing both his defensive coordinators in the same coaching cycle.
hey, whatever, man. That bag still weighs the same. I think that is something that is interesting for Ryan Day, because here's what I do plus value for Ryan Day: game planning, play caller. Putting together an offense from a scheme perspective, and recruiting, specifically loading up a quarterback and a wide receiver room to be able to win. What is it that Ryan Day said on CBS Sports HQ with Dennis Dodd? Is like, you run the ball to win the games, you throw the ball to win championships. It is clear what his mindset is, but Ohio State defending that pass was a huge issue the year prior. And then this year, the pass rush, as you mentioned, very disappointing considering the personnel. So I think that this is an interesting challenge in Ryan Day's young career as a head coach, relatively, to see if he's good at identifying and being able to bring in the right personalities as well as what is the best available. Because Jim Knowles is one of the best defensive coordinators based on performance exclusively in this season in the entire country. So it does feel very, very soccer, very transfer window, very like, well, we've got all the resources, we've got all the money, we've got all the best players. Let's just Man City this thing and have a $350 million bench. Like, let's just come on. Let's just get more and more and more of it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's some clubs buy players, some clubs sell players, and we see what Ohio State is. It's buying coaches. I almost said buying players, but that could cause a lot of problems.
That would never happen in college football.
I'm not alleging any of that took place. It's just an analogy and a comparison to soccer where they legitimately buy players. So
the Ohio State defensive side of the ball, I've mentioned this a few times during the season, but I do think that there's probably a personnel upgraded on the back end of that defense. And it's that unfair thing that I do with Alabama. It's the unfair thing that I do, with a Clemson, where you're comparing the current roster to these other rosters in the past. And you're saying, okay, well, remember when you had certified pros that were going to be first, second round draft picks at all three levels of the defense. And I didn't feel that way as much this year. Now they're very talented. And of course you get into the combine situation. Ohio State's going to end up having a lot of NFL draft picks. But I do wonder if, Jim Knowles, one of the tasks is going to be being able to identify, evaluate, recruit players to level up such that we get back to that point where, how many years in a row was it where it was just another Ohio State defensive back? They were one after another after another. And it seems like we've hit a little bit of a break in that cycle.
Yeah, I think losing Jeff Hafley to Boston College definitely played a role there, because he was a very good coach in the secondary before becoming a defensive coordinator. But I just think that, like, it's one of those things you mentioned, like comparing it to previous iterations of that same program's defense or offense. I think there's also the context that when you look at Alabama or Ohio State or schools like that, you compare it to the current roster. And when you look at Ohio State, like, they have a really good offensive line. They have the best receivers in the country. They have a Heisman finalist quarterback. They've got excellent defensive linemen and linebackers. And it's like, compared to the rest of the roster, it's like, oh, the secondary doesn't look nearly as good. But that secondary is probably one of the best secondary. Like, there's a whole teams in the country who'd be like, I'll take all four of those guys right now and put them in the top of my depth chart if you don't think they're that great. So there's always that kind of context alongside with it. And I do think that, like, the other secondaries, like those guys, the Akutas and those guys, they benefited from playing behind Chase Young, Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa.
But like, Denzel Ward, Marshawn Lattimore.
All great players. Dudes. Yeah, they're all great players, but they also didn't have to cover guys very long because they had a pass rush that was getting to the QB. And if not getting the sack, at least forcing the throw out sooner. So it's like, it's easy. Ask any defensive back in the country. It's easier to cover a guy for 3 seconds than it is for 5. Like, it's impossible to do it for 5.
And as you mentioned before, you go and you find the defensive coordinator who had a defense that was leading the way in the smart and the dumb stats. The total sacks, the sack rate, the pressure rate. He checks all the boxes. There's nothing too mainstream or too hipster. Jim Knowles was one of the best defensive coordinators in the entire country, and Oklahoma State had one of the best defenses, a good hire for the Buckeyes.